Lady Isabel Langford stood at the refreshment table in her family's drawing room, watching Lord Adrian Thorne, Duke of Caverley, approach through a crowd of tenants and neighbors, and her chest tightened with a fury so precise it felt like a blade between her ribs. 5 years since she had last stood in the same room with him. 5 years since she had fled to Vienna to build a life from music and solitude. And the man looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, composed, his hands moving behind his back, into that rigid parliamentary posture she had once mistaken for indifference. She had returned to England because her brother William was dying, and she had expected an empty house, quiet grief, the slow work of saying goodbye. Instead, she had found Adrian Thorne sitting at William's desk every Thursday, managing the estate accounts with the meticulous care of a man who had taken up residence in the center of her family's collapse. The county whispered that the Duke practically lived at Langford now, that he had been present through every crisis of William's illness, and Isabel did not know which feeling burned hotter. The anger that he had managed her inheritance without informing her, or the older, deeper wound that he had said nothing, absolutely nothing, when she had needed him 5 years ago and driven away believing his silence meant he did not care. September light slanted through the tall windows of the Langford drawing room, illuminating dust motes and the faces of tenants who had come to the harvest gathering in William's name. Isabel had hosted the event herself, her first public appearance since returning from Vienna a week earlier, and she could feel the weight of every gaze that fell on her. The whispers about the Earl's dying sister, the woman who had spent 5 years abroad and come home to a house half empty, and a brother who could no longer leave his bed. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, her dark hair pinned in the style she had learned in the Viennese salons, and she stood at the refreshment table with the posture of a performer who had learned to command attention without asking for it. Then Adrian Thorne entered the room as though he had been summoned by duty rather than invitation, and perhaps he had. Every tenant on the Langford estate knew the Duke had been managing the property for 18 months, ensuring the school remained funded, and the cottages were repaired and the accounts were balanced with a precision that William's illness had made impossible. He moved through the crowd with the same controlled grace Isabel remembered, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his expression calm and unreadable. When he reached the refreshment table, he inclined his head in the smallest possible acknowledgement of her presence. "Lady Isabel," he said, his voice low and steady. "Vienna has agreed with you." Isabel set down the glass she had been holding and met his gaze directly. "Your Grace," she replied, "England appears to have agreed with no one. You look precisely as I remember. Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation." She picked up a second glass and handed it to him, their fingers overlapping briefly on the stem. He withdrew too fast, the speed of the retraction more revealing than a lingering touch would have been, and his right hand closed into a fist at his side. Isabel watched the movement with the trained eye of a woman who had spent 5 years learning to notice what people concealed. "I also observe," she continued, her voice pitched low enough that the tenants nearby could not hear, "that you have managed my brother's estate for 18 months without informing me, that you have repaired the South Cottages using the Langford accounts, and that you arrive every Thursday at 9 and leave at 4. Did you imagine I would not learn this?" Adrian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I imagined your brother would tell you." "My brother is dying," Isabel said, and the words came out sharper than she had intended. "He tells me very little. You apparently tell me less." Before Adrian could answer, Mrs. Hartley, the vicar's wife, approached with the bright, invasive cheerfulness of a woman who had decided that other people's grief was an appropriate topic for social conversation. "Lady Isabel," she said warmly, "how wonderful that the Duke has been such a friend to the family during William's illness. One hears he practically lives at Langford." Isabel felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten, but she kept her expression pleasant. "One hears correctly," she said. "Okay, I am still determining why." Adrian's hands moved behind his back, the posture she had watched him adopt at every gathering they had attended together before Vienna, the rigid stance of a man in Parliament or at a lectern. She had always read it as distance, the physical manifestation of a mind that preferred logic to emotion. Now, standing 3 feet away from him in her family's drawing room, she wondered if she had been wrong. "Because someone needed to be present," Adrian said quietly, his gaze fixed somewhere past Isabel's shoulder. "That word again," Isabel replied. "Present. You have been present at my brother's desk and absent from every other conversation in my life for 5 years. Forgive me if I find present confusing." Adrian opened his mouth as though to respond, then closed it again. His right hand, he'd still behind his back, gripped his left wrist with enough force that Isabel could see the tension travel up his arm. Mrs. Hartley, oblivious to the voltage crackling between them, smiled and moved on to greet another guest. Isabel turned away from Adrian and picked up her glass again, her fingers steady despite the fury that burned in her chest. She had spent 5 years learning to perform composure in concert halls where a single wrong note could end a career, and she would not let this man, this infuriatingly silent, maddeningly controlled man, see how much his presence unsettled her. "I will be visiting William this afternoon," she said without looking at him. "I expect we will have much to discuss regarding the estate. You need not attend unless he specifically requests it." "He will request it," Adrian said. "Then you may come." Isabel set down her glass and walked toward the door, her spine straight and her hands relaxed at her sides. She did not look back, but she could feel his gaze on her as she left the room, and the weight of it made her want to scream. The Langford Library occupied the east wing of the house, a long room lined with shelves that reached to the ceiling and filled with the scent of old leather and dust. Adrian sat at William's desk, the desk that had belonged to Isabel's father before William inherited it, the desk where 3 generations of Langford Earls had managed the estate, and worked through the account ledgers with the methodical attention that had kept the property solvent through 18 months of William's decline. The numbers were precise and unyielding, and he was grateful for their clarity. The numbers did not require him to speak or to explain or to meet anyone's eyes. Through the wall to his left, he could hear the faint sound of a harpsichord. The music room shared a wall with the library, and Isabel had begun practicing there every afternoon since her return. She played Scarlatti, Sonata in D minor, the piece he had heard her perform once at a private gathering years ago, before everything had collapsed. He knew the piece well enough now to anticipate every phrase, every modulation, every moment where her hands moved across the keys with the precision of someone who had trained herself to feel nothing while playing everything. She reached the 30-second bar, the passage where the melodies shifted from restraint into something darker and more vulnerable, and Adrian's pen stopped moving. He waited for the modulation, and answered the harmonic turn that Scarlatti had written to break the listener's heart. But Isabel pulled back before the shift could land. She played the passage with technical perfection and emotional withdrawal, and then she moved on to the next section, as though the withheld moment had never existed. Adrian set down his pen and pressed his palm flat against the wall. The vibration of each string traveled through the stone and into his hand, and he closed his eyes and let the sound fill the space behind his ribs where he had learned to store everything he could not say. His hand trembled against the wall. The involuntary confession his body had been making for 5 years, the physiological betrayal he could only manage through rigid postural control, in drawing rooms and parliamentary sessions. Yet he could conceal the tremor by clasping his hands behind his back or gripping the arms of his chair. But here, alone in the library, with no one watching, he let his hand shake against the wall and felt the music move through his palm like a pulse. The door opened behind him, and Adrian pulled his hand back and clasped both hands together on the desk. Dawson, his valet, entered carrying a tray with tea and a folded letter. "From the steward at Caverly, Your Grace," Dawson said, setting the tray on the corner of the desk. His gaze flicked briefly to Adrian's hands, then away. Dawson had been with Adrian for 10 years, long enough to have watched the tremor begin 3 years ago, and worsen into the uncontrollable shaking that now defined Adrian's private hours. He never commented on it, but Adrian knew he noticed. "Thank you, Dawson," Adrian said. He unfolded the letter and scanned its contents, a report on the autumn planting, a question about repairs to the north gate, and set it aside. Through the wall, Isabel had stopped playing. The quiet that settled afterward felt heavier than the music had been. Dawson poured the tea and left without speaking. Adrian sat alone in the library, his hands trembling on the desk, and listened to the absence of music. Mrs. Calloway, the Langford housekeeper, had managed the household for 23 years, long enough to have watched Isabel grow from a sharp-tongued girl who corrected her tutor's Latin into the composed woman who now walked the corridors with the distant grace of someone who had learned to survive alone. She had also watched Lord Adrian Thorne arrive at Langford every Thursday for 18 months, his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression carefully blank. And she had noticed things that no one else seemed to see. She found Isabel in William's sitting room 2 days after the harvest gathering, standing by the window with her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the garden below. William was asleep in the next room. His breathing labored but steady, and the physician had left instructions that he was not to be disturbed until evening. "Your Grace," Mrs. Calloway said quietly. Isabel turned, and the housekeeper saw the exhaustion in her face, the kind of weariness that came not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many unanswered questions. I thought you should know. The estate accounts are in excellent order. His Grace the Duke has ensured that the school remains funded. The tenant cottages have been repaired. And the harvest proceeds are properly allocated. Without his work, the property would have collapsed. Isabel's jaw tightened. I am aware, she said. William has made it quite clear that dismissing the Duke would harm the people who depend on Langford. I appear to be locked into proximity with a man I have spent 5 years attempting to forget. Mrs. Calloway hesitated and stepped closer. Your Grace, she said carefully, there is something you should know. When you practice harpsichord in the music room, His Grace the Duke works in the library. Every day he presses his hand against the wall. I have seen him do it dozens of times. Isabel stared at her. What do you mean? He presses his hand against the wall? Exactly that, Your Grace. He sits at the desk, and when you play, he stops working and places his palm flat against the stone. He stays that way until you finish. I thought at first it was the building settling, but it is not. It is the Duke, every day. When you play. Isabel turned back to the window, her hands gripping the sill. Why would he do that? I cannot say, Your Grace, but I thought you should know. After Mrs. Calloway left, Isabel walked to the music room and closed the door behind her. The harpsichord sat in the center of the room, its polished wood gleaming in the afternoon light. She crossed to the wall that separated the music room from the library and pressed her own palm against the cold stone. She stood there for a long moment, her hand flat against the wall, and imagined Adrian Thorne on the other side, his hand in the same position, and the vibration of the strings traveling through the stone and into his palm. Two people touching the same wall from opposite sides, neither willing to walk through the door. The days that followed settled into a pattern that felt both inevitable and unbearable. Adrian arrived at Langford every Thursday morning and worked in the library until late afternoon. Isabel practiced harpsichord in the music room, her fingers moving across the keys with the precision of someone who had learned to channel grief into sound. They did not speak unless William's condition required it, and even then, their conversations were brief and formal, conducted in the presence of the physician or Mrs. Calloway. But Isabel watched him. She could not stop herself from watching him, herself. So she catalogued the way he gripped the arms of his chair when he sat in William's room, his knuckles white against the dark wood. She noticed the walking stick he carried despite moving with perfect health, the way he used it to steady himself when he thought no one was looking. She saw the way his hands moved behind his back every time she entered a room, the rigid posture that she had once dismissed as coldness and now began to see as concealment. One afternoon, she sat across from him in William's sitting room while the physician examined her brother in the next room. Adrian held a ledger in his lap, his hands gripping the edges with enough force that the leather cover bent slightly under the pressure. His right hand trembled, just a faint, barely visible shaking, and he pressed it harder against the ledger as though he could force the tremor into stillness through sheer will. Isabel leaned forward slightly. Your hand, she said quietly. Does it pain you? Adrian looked up, his expression carefully blank. No. Then why do you grip the ledger as though it might escape? He set the ledger aside and clasped his hands together in his lap, the tremor hidden beneath the pressure of his own grip. It is nothing, Lady Isabel. It does not look like nothing. He met her eyes. Nevertheless. The physician emerged from William's room before Isabel could press further, and Adrian stood and excused himself with the same formal courtesy he had shown her since the harvest gathering. Isabel watched him leave, the walking stick in his left hand and his right hand clenched into a fist at his side. And she felt the fury in her chest shift into something more complicated and harder to name. That evening, Mrs. Hartley stopped Isabel in the village and asked, with the blunt curiosity of a woman who believed herself entitled to an answer, Lady Isabel, is there an understanding between you and the Duke? The entire county has noticed his constant presence at Langford, and with you unmarried and residing in the same house. There is no understanding, Isabel said, her voice sharp enough to cut. His Grace manages the estate because my brother cannot. That is the extent of our arrangement. Mrs. Hartley raised her eyebrows, but said nothing more. Isabel walked home through the autumn twilight, and her hands shaking with a rage she could not fully articulate. There was no understanding. There was a man whose body had been confessing what his mouth would not say, and a woman who had spent 5 years training herself not to notice stillness. William had a lucid afternoon in late September, one of the rare moments when the fog of illness lifted and his mind sharpened into the clarity of the man he had been before consumption had begun to hollow him out. Isabel sat beside his bed, her hand resting lightly on his, and they spoke quietly about the estate, the tenants, the small details of daily life that had once seemed ordinary, and now felt precious. Adrian arrived at 2 o'clock with a folder of estate papers, and William gestured for him to sit. Adrian took the chair on the opposite side of the bed, his posture rigid and his hands clasped in his lap. For a long moment, William said nothing. He simply looked between them, his sister, who had built a life in Vienna on the certainty that a man's silence meant indifference, and the Duke, who had spent 5 years performing indifference while his body fell apart. "Adrian," William said finally, his voice hoarse but steady. "Show her your hands." Adrian went completely still. Isabel looked at her brother, confused. "William, what?" "Show her," William repeated, his gaze fixed on Adrian. "Or I will tell her what they cost you." Adrian did not move. His hands remained clasped in his lap, hidden beneath the rigid control he had maintained for 5 years. William turned to Isabel. She saw in his face the determination of a dying man who had carried a secret too long. "5 years ago," William said, "this man destroyed your engagement to protect you from a fraud. Frederick Vane intended to marry you to gain legal access to the Langford Mineral Corridor for a canal syndicate. The investors included Adrian's own father, the 7th Duke of Caverly. Adrian discovered the scheme, brought me proof, and asked me to break the engagement without ever mentioning his involvement. He carried that silence because I asked him to, and because he believed, rightly or wrongly, that if you knew he had loved you since you were 17, you would feel gratitude, and gratitude from you was unbearable to him." Isabel felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at William, then at Adrian, who had not moved or spoken. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," William continued, "that Adrian has visited me every week for 18 months, not because I need an estate manager, but because I am the only person alive who knows what he did. And proximity to the witness is the closest he comes to proximity to you." He turned back to Adrian. "Show her your hands, Adrian." Slowly, so slowly it seemed to take years, Adrian brought his hands forward from his lap. They trembled. Not a faint, barely visible shaking, but a pronounced, uncontrollable tremor that made his fingers twitch against the fabric of his trousers. William's voice softened. "They have done that since you left for Vienna. Ask Mrs. Calloway. Ask Dawson. Everyone in this household has watched his hands shake for 5 years. He grips walking sticks, chair arms, the edge of my desk. He clasps them behind his back so no one sees. His body has been telling the truth since the day you drove away, and he has spent 5 years trying to silence it." Isabel stared at Adrian's trembling hands, and something inside her chest broke open, not cleanly, but in jagged pieces that tore at her ribs. "5 years," she whispered. "You let me believe?" "William asked me not to tell you," Adrian said, his voice barely audible. "And I could not." "William is dying," Isabel said, and her voice cracked on the word. "What happens to the truth when he's gone?" Adrian had no answer. William closed his eyes, the lucidity already beginning to fade. "Do not let him leave this house without telling you the rest," he said quietly. "I will not be here much longer to tell it for him." Isabel stood abruptly and walked out of the room, her hands shaking and her breath coming too fast. No, she heard Adrian rise behind her, heard him say her name, but she did not stop. She walked to the music room and closed the door and sat at the harpsichord with her hands hovering over the keys. She began to play the Scarlatti. She reached the 30-second bar, the passage where the melody demanded full emotional commitment, the modulation she had withheld for 5 years, and she stopped. Completely. Her hands fell into her lap, and she sat in the silence that followed, unable to play through what she felt. From the other side of the wall, there was no sound, no footsteps, no door closing, just the empty air between them. 10 days passed. 10 days of withdrawal and silence, as of Isabel practicing scales instead of the Scarlatti and Adrian, arriving at Langford with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression more carefully blank than ever. William's condition worsened. The lucid afternoon had been a brief reprieve, and now the fog returned, thicker and more persistent. The physician came twice a day and spoke in low tones about managing pain and preparing for the inevitable. At 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 10th day, Mrs. Calloway knocked on Isabel's door and said, "Your Grace, you must come. Lord William is hemorrhaging." Isabel ran to her brother's room in her nightgown and dressing gown, her hair loose and her feet bare. William lay in the bed with blood staining the sheets around him, his breathing shallow, and his face the color of old parchment. The physician had been sent for, but he lived 30 minutes away. And 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. Isabel pressed compresses to William's chest, her hands slick with blood, and tried to remember everything the physician had taught her about managing a crisis. She heard the front door open downstairs, heard footsteps on the stairs, and then Adrian was in the doorway, his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Mrs. Calloway sent for me," he said. "I need your hands," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her throat. "He's convulsing. I cannot hold him still and apply pressure at the same time." Adrian crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. Isabel pointed to William's shoulders. "Hold him here, both arms. Press down and do not let go." Adrian reached out, yet wherein his hands trembled so violently that he could not grip. Isabel saw the tremor, saw the way his fingers twitched uselessly above William's shoulders, and she did not hesitate. She seized Adrian's wrists and placed his palms where they needed to be, her hands over his, pressing them flat against William's convulsing body. "Hold," she said, her voice fierce. "Don't let go." Adrian held. Through Isabel's grip, his hands steadied enough to apply pressure, and she guided him through the next 3 hours, adjusting his position when the tremor returned, pressing her hands over his to force steadiness into him, her precision steering his failure. By the time the physician arrived, William had stabilized. The hemorrhage had slowed, and his breathing, though labored, was no longer the ragged gasping of a man drowning in his own blood. The physician took over, and Isabel and Adrian stepped into the corridor. Dawn was beginning to break outside the windows, the gray light turning the corridor into a liminal space between night and day. Both of them were exhausted, their sleeves stained with blood, and the pretense that had held them apart for 5 years had been burned away by a night where the only thing that mattered was whether hands could hold steady. Isabel slid down the wall and sat on the floor, her back against the cold plaster. Adrian sat across from her, his hands resting on his knees, still trembling. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Tell me you feel nothing," Isabel said finally, her voice raw. "And I'll walk away." Adrian looked at her, and she saw the mask assembling behind his eyes, the careful, uncontrolled expression he had worn for 5 years. "I feel nothing," he said. Isabel looked at his right hand, the hand she had held flat against William's chest for 3 hours, the hand that was shaking so hard now that his fingers tapped against his knee. "Then why are you trembling?" The mask shattered. Adrian closed his eyes and pressed his hands flat against the floor, as though he could force the tremor into the stone. "I am tired," he said. "You are lying." Isabel leaned forward, her voice rising. "You have been lying for 5 years. Your hands have been telling me the truth since I returned, and you have been clasping them behind your back, gripping every surface in this house, performing control while your body falls apart. Tonight I held your hand steady so you could hold my brother alive. I felt what is inside you. I felt it through your skin. You do not understand what the silence cost." "I understand what it cost me," Isabel said, and her voice broke. 5 years. A country. A life I built on the assumption that the man who said nothing had nothing to say. Tonight I held your hand steady, Adrian. I felt you. I felt everything you have been trying to hide, and I'm telling you now, no more. My brother said to ask you for the rest. He's running out of time to tell it for you, so tell me now. Not tomorrow. Not when you have composed the correct sentence. Tell me in this corridor where we both smell of blood and there is no performance left. Why did you do it? Why did you destroy my engagement? And why? For 5 years? Did you not say? Adrian looked up at her, his hands open on his knees, the tremor visible and undeniable. Because my father was Frederick's investor, he said, his voice hoarse. The money that funded the scheme to take your family's land came from the Thorne estate. My name, my inheritance. I discovered it, and I told William. And when I destroyed the engagement, I asked him never to tell you because... His voice broke. Not a performance. A fracture. Because if you knew I had loved you since you were 17, you would feel gratitude. And gratitude from you. From the woman who corrected my Latin and argued with my logic and made every room brighter simply by being annoyed in it. Gratitude was something I could not bear. I would rather you thought me cold than feel obligated. I would rather you hated me in Vienna than thanked me in England. Isabel stared at him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. That was not your choice to make. He nodded slowly. No. 5 years of my life. Built on a lie. Built on my lie, Adrian said. The life you built is real. Vienna is real. The music is real. The woman you became is real. My silence does not undo what you built. It only explains why you had to build it somewhere else. And the trembling? Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Adrian looked down at his hands, at the uncontrollable shaking that had defined his private hours for 5 years. That is what happens when a man holds a door shut for 5 years, and the person on the other side is the only person he wants to let in. The corridor was silent, except for the faint sound of the physician moving in William's room. The gray light from the window turned to pale gold as the sun rose. And Isabel knelt in front of Adrian and took both his trembling hands in hers. "Stop holding the door," she said. His hands inside hers trembled, then steadied. Not through her grip this time, but through his choice. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed her, slow, deliberate. The kiss of a man who had spent 5 years retreating and was now, finally, advancing. When they pulled apart, his hands were still. William died 11 days later, peacefully in the morning. The sun was shining through the window of his room, and Isabel sat on his left side, holding his hand, while Adrian sat on his right. William's breathing had been shallow for hours, and the physician had said it would not be long. Before the end, William's eyes opened with a clarity that had been absent for weeks. He looked at Adrian, and then at Isabel. "You told her," he said, his voice barely audible. Adrian nodded. "Yes. And?" Isabel squeezed her brother's hand gently. "And he is still here," she said. "Which is more than you gave me odds for." William smiled, the last expression his face made. Then his breathing stopped. Isabel held his hand for a long time after, and Adrian stayed beside her, his presence steady and quiet. The funeral was held a week later. The entire county attended, filling the small church and spilling out into the churchyard. Isabel stood at the front, her face composed and her hand steady, and Adrian stood beside her, not behind her, but beside her, his hand. The household adjusted around a change it had been waiting for. A week after the funeral, Isabel sat at the harpsichord in the music room and played the Scarlatti. She reached the 30-second bar, the passage where the melody shifted from restraint into something darker and more vulnerable. And this time she did not pull back. She played through the modulation, letting the harmonic turn land with the full weight Scarlatti had intended. And the sound filled the room with a raw, aching beauty. The door opened, and Adrian appeared in the doorway. Not on the library side of the wall, but inside the music room itself. The threshold finally crossed. He had discarded his coat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and he looked at her with an expression that held no pretense and no performance. "You played the passage," he said. She nodded. "I played the passage." It sounded different. It sounded complete. Isabel gestured to the narrow bench beside her. The reviewer in Vienna was right. I was holding back. I have been holding back since I left England, because the music knows what the performer conceals. And what I was concealing was that I left not because I was indifferent, but because I was not. Adrian crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench designed for one person. She did not move to make room. He fit himself into the space she occupied, shoulder to shoulder, and the warmth of him against her side felt like the answer to a question she had been asking for 5 years. "Play it again," he said. She played. He sat inside the sound, the vibration arriving directly through the bench they shared, through the shoulder pressed to his, being through the air they both breathed. His hand rested on the closed lid of the harpsichord, and when she finished, she placed her hand over his. The last note vibrated through the wood, through both their palms, and faded into the room. "Your hands are still," Isabel said quietly. "There is nothing left to hold in," Adrian replied. The door between the music room and the library stood open. The wall remained, stone does not move. But no one stood on opposite sides, pressing their palms to what separated them. Spring came to Langford in the weeks that followed, and the estate began to recover under Isabel's management and Adrian's steady support. Mrs. Calloway brought tea to the music room one afternoon and set 2 cups on the table beside the harpsichord. The first time she had set 2 cups in that room, she did not comment. She had been arranging proximity for months. Now the proximity arranged itself. Isabel played the Scarlatti every afternoon, and Adrian sat beside her on the narrow bench, his hand resting on the lid and his shoulder pressed to hers. The music filled the room and traveled through the open door into the library, and the sound was complete. Nothing withheld, nothing concealed, everything released. The woman who had built a life in Vienna on the certainty that a man's silence meant indifference had learned that silence could also be devotion, and the Duke, whose body had been confessing for 5 years, had finally spoken the truth aloud. What remained was not the weight of what had been hidden, but the lightness of what had been released. The harpsichord strings vibrated under their joined hands, and the sound faded into a room where the door was open, and the wall no longer separated them. Fulfilled and serene.